Welcome, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to have you all here for today's university-level explainer. We are unpacking a genuinely fascinating, deeply complex historical narrative today, heavily drawing from the phenomenal work of historian Ayesha Jalal. We're going to be exploring what we can call the central paradox of Pakistan. Now think about this. It is the only modern state explicitly created as a homeland for a religious community, yet, from its very inception, it has continually struggled to define exactly what that means. Understanding this specific struggle is absolutely crucial, and not just for South Asian history, but for grasping how modern states all over the world grapple with the incredibly volatile intersection of religion and nationalism. Reconciling a self-proclaimed Islamic identity with the rigid, concrete imperatives of a modern nation-state is, well, it's no easy task. And this foundational struggle, this identity crisis, has shaped literally every single decade of the nation's history.
Okay, let's jump right into our syllabus for today. We have a really robust historical roadmap to traverse. We'll kick things off by examining the original demand for Pakistan, followed by the early rise of military dominance, the catastrophic loss of East Pakistan, the era of Islamization, and then Pakistan's highly complex role as a geostrategic asset. And just a quick heads up to set our parameters, we are going to culminate our journey strictly in the year 2014, as that is exactly where our source material concludes. All right, let's get started.
Transitioning into our first act, Section 1, the demand for Pakistan. We really have to recognize right away that the foundational ideas for this nation were far more ambiguous than modern national myths might suggest. To truly grasp this, we need to look at how early Muslim leaders actually defined their own identity way before the intense political pressures of the 1940s kicked in. Take the term Qawm, for example. In the late 19th century, pioneering figures, like the great educationist Sayyid Aman Khan, used Qawm to mean a community based on the inhabitants of a given country, completely regardless of their internal diversities. This definition is a huge deal. It served as the baseline for early Muslim political thought in the region. Sayyid Aman Khan viewed Indian Muslims not as some distinct, separate territorial race that needed to be fenced off, but rather as a vibrant community deeply, fundamentally woven into the shared culture, the history, and the physical landscape of the Indian subcontinent. But then, conversely, we have the concept of the Ummah. This is the super-territorial, worldwide community of Islamic believers. The source material highlights a massive, foundational ideological contradiction right here. Think about it. How on earth do you reconcile the non-territorial, universal, borderless Ummah with the rigid physical borders required by a modern nation-state? What does this mean for an everyday citizen? Are your ultimate loyalties to your geographic neighbors who might have different faiths? Or to a global religious brotherhood living thousands of miles away? This was an immediate, profound conundrum for the new nation. It baked in an identity crisis from day one that continues to echo through its entire history. And this brilliantly illustrates the mindset of Pakistan's founding father, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Just 6 years before Pakistan actually appeared on the map, he was telling people to live as good neighbors and uniting to tell outside powers, hands off India. It is so vital to understand the historical context of 1941 here. At this specific stage, the idea of an entirely separate, heavily partitioned state was still largely viewed by many as a powerful political bargaining chip, not an absolute inevitability. Jinnah initially envisioned a power-sharing arrangement in a unified, confederated subcontinent, where Muslims had equal political weight. He was definitely not aiming for a bloody, absolute partition of the land.
The reality of partition, however, stood in stark, devastating contrast to that ideal vision. Jinnah's political strategy was fundamentally about demanding autonomy and constitutional parity, a concept of shared sovereignty. But the gritty reality of the 1947 partition, it was radically different. The sheer trauma and the scale of the displacement were staggering. We are talking about uprooting millions of families overnight in a wave of unimaginable, horrific violence. It resulted in a border division that Jinnah himself bitterly described as mutilated and moth-eaten. It abruptly forced Pakistan to build a central government completely from scratch, stretched over geographically divided, economically disconnected territories.
This brings us chronologically right into our second section, early military dominance. We need to explore how the immediate and chaotic aftermath of this partition tilted domestic power sharply and pretty much permanently away from democratic institutions.
At independence, Pakistan inherited a critical, almost fatal structural imbalance. To put this into perspective, the new nation received a staggering 30% of undivided India's defense forces, but only 17.5% of its financial assets. Consider what that actually meant for the daily functioning of this brand new government. It meant there was barely enough money in the bank to pay civil servants, build essential infrastructure, or establish basic public services. Instead, the new state was heavily burdened with an overwhelming defense establishment right out of the gate. This severe structural imbalance created an intense existential fear within the government, a fear that drove an immediate, relentless push for administrative centralization, completely at the expense of democracy. And this centralization came at a massive cost to the Awam. Now, Awam translates to the people, the broad citizenry. And it was absolutely the Awam who bore the brunt of Pakistan's early lapse into military authoritarianism. The democratic aspirations of the diverse regional populations were systematically sidelined by a newly emerging, incredibly powerful alliance of unelected civil bureaucrats and military officers. But how did they actually justify this to the Awam? Well, they framed it as a matter of pure state survival. The running narrative was that national security, especially in the face of hostile borders, simply had to take precedence over democratic rights and regional representation.
This centralization followed a very distinct domino-like trajectory. First up, you have severe resource scarcity. Add to that the immediate outbreak of the Kashmir conflict with India, heavily driven by fears over vital water security. To fund the military for this specific conflict, the state enforced harsh administrative centralization, systematically stripping power away from the regional provinces. Finally, desperate to build up defense capabilities against its much larger neighbor, Pakistan aligned firmly with the West. They entered into foreign military agreements like the SEATO and CENTO Pacts by 1954. This alliance brought in American military aid, which, you guessed it, further entrenched and empowered the military elite at the direct expense of any domestic political development.
Which leads us directly into Section 3, covering the most catastrophic consequence of this centralized, military authoritarian rule: the loss of the country's eastern wing.
The most glaring issue here was the sheer demographic imbalance. East Bengal actually held roughly 54% of the entire country's population. They were the literal democratic majority. Yet, political and economic power, along with the military headquarters and the absolute lion's share of development funds, were heavily monopolized by West Pakistan. The West Pakistani elite flatly refused to accept this Bengali democratic majority. Instead of power sharing, they engaged in severe cultural and linguistic suppression, treating the Eastern Wing almost like an internal colony, which slowly but inevitably fractured the entire nation.
We can trace this fracture along a clear, incredibly tragic timeline. Back in 1952, the center's stubborn insistence on an Urdu-only national language policy led to Language Martyrs' Day, where protesting Bengali students were actually killed by police. In 1955, we see the tragic irony of the one-unit policy. In a desperate bid to artificially counterbalance the Bengali majority, the central government essentially smashed all the diverse provinces of West Pakistan into a single administrative unit. By trying to force this rigid, unnatural unity just to suppress democratic realities, the state practically guaranteed its own fracture. This continuous suppression of regional identities inevitably culminated in the horrific 1971 Civil War and the creation of an independent Bangladesh. It proved that a shared religion alone simply could not hold the state together against the crushing weight of political disenfranchisement.
Following that devastating loss, we transition to our fourth act, Section 4, Islamization and Proxy Wars. We're stepping into the era of General Zia-ul-Haq in the late 70s and 80s, where military dominance merged with a massive state-sponsored project of religious extremism.
General Zia's era fundamentally altered Pakistan's trajectory. It all began with a military coup and the subsequent highly controversial execution of the popularly elected Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Concurrently, you have the Soviet invasion of neighboring Afghanistan, which led the US and Saudi Arabia to heavily, and I mean heavily, fund Pakistan's intelligence services, the ISI. The ISI evolved rapidly during this specific period from a standard intelligence body into a massive, flush-with-cash apparatus managing the Afghan jihad. This massive influx of foreign money also brought rigid Wahhabi Salafist doctrines straight into the country, and the consequences for the Awam were severe. These imported hardline doctrines clashed violently with the diverse, deeply rooted Sufi traditions of the local population. It completely shattered the domestic sectarian balance and literally transformed the country into a bloody staging ground for proxy wars.
As Ayesha Jalal's source material so powerfully summarizes this era, the proverbial tent has been metaphorically transformed into a sprawling military barrack. I really want you to think about the psychological impact on a society when its foundational structure shifts from a communal, accommodating tent to a fortified, rigid barrack. It means that civil society is constantly viewed through a strict, paranoid lens of national security.
Driven by Cold War dynamics and deep regional insecurities, the state continually prioritized intelligence operations and military expansion way over democratic resilience and the fundamental rights of its own citizens. Which brings us to a highly provocative question, one you really need to chew on. How did a state that served as a vital, frontline U.S. ally simultaneously become a sanctuary for extremism? It's a staggering contradiction, and honestly, it is the complex geostrategic riddle that completely defines the post-9/11 era in Pakistan.
Let's move right into Section 5, a geostrategic asset. We are now focusing on General Pervez Musharraf's regime and the dual role Pakistan played in the global war on terror at the dawn of the 21st century.
The diplomatic turnaround at the turn of the millennium was absolutely dizzying. In 1999, following another military coup and nuclear tests, Pakistan was largely viewed as an international pariah. It was heavily sanctioned and isolated, especially for its ongoing support of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. Yet, literally almost overnight after September 11, 2001, Pakistan became an indispensable top-tier strategic partner to the United States. It received billions with a B of dollars in military aid and massive debt rescheduling. But we have to ask the obvious question, did those billions go toward enriching the lives of the Awam, or did it just reinforce the military barrack? The profound paradox of this era is that the U.S. was now heavily funding and relying on the very intelligence services that had originally crafted and supported the Taliban, essentially asking them to dismantle their own creation.
Consequently, the state was pulled violently apart by fiercely competing factions. You had the military and ISI desperately trying to balance their highly lucrative alliance with America, while simultaneously trying to pacify, or at least manage, radicalized domestic Islamist militant groups. Meanwhile, civilian political clans jockeyed for absolutely whatever power they could grasp. And at the bottom of it all, the civil society, the Awam, remained totally caught in the crossfire. We must emphasize the human cost here. The Awam bore the immense brunt of these high-level geopolitical games, suffering daily from severe insecurity, massive energy shortages, economic stagnation, and rampant, terrifying terrorism.
Let's move to our final era, Section 6, the 2014 crossroads. We want to see where this historical argument culminates, and keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, our historical account strictly stops at the year 2014, capturing a pivotal moment where Pakistan stood at a massive, massive crossroads. By 2014, Pakistan was navigating what you could only call a perfect storm of converging crises. You had the impending U.S. military withdrawal from Afghanistan, severe domestic terrorism blowback that tragically claimed tens of thousands of lives, and a crippling national energy crisis that literally left major cities in the dark for hours on end. But, and this is crucial, the sources also highlight moments of profound hope and defiance from the Awam. Despite the systemic violence and heavily restrictive laws, we see incredible, vibrant resilience expressing itself through a robust, rebellious pop culture. Musicians, artists, and political satirists continually push back against the state's military narrative, fiercely claiming their own space in the public sphere. Furthermore, the country actually achieved a historic milestone. In 2013, for the very first time in its history, an elected civilian government completed its full term and peacefully transferred power to another elected civilian government without a military intervention. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. As Pakistan continues to navigate the intense, complicated legacies of its creation, its shifting alliances, and its deep institutional imbalances, will the Awam, the people, ultimately reclaim the democratic state they were originally promised, or will the sprawling military barrack endure? Your key takeaway today is that a nation's identity is rarely permanently settled at its physical borders. It is a continuous, often painful negotiation between the entrenched power of the state and the enduring will of its people. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the history around you.